Kia ora. Thank you, Chris and Andrew, for the invite. Thank you for the people of Oxford Terrace for having me here tonight. Thank you for the people who are not of Oxford Terrace who have come to engage with us. Tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou katoa. I kind of got involved with this, I think because I woke up on Easter Sunday morning, and when I woke up on Easter Sunday morning this year, I went out to the little place we were staying in outside Blenheim, and we're on holiday. 2 days later we got COVID, so that obviously indicates this was the wrong thing to have done. But read the Stuff broadcast for the day and saw that it was Easter Sunday morning, and the broadcast from Stuff, the only one which was on the Christian church, was on the accusations about the Arise church. And it really ticked me off. I thought, this is Easter Sunday, and all we media can do is kind of take the opportunity to highlight the demise of a particular large church. Although on the other side of this, I also think the media has been the prophetic voice to the church, that the church has failed to support and nurture within its own self. But that kind of annoyed me on that particular day, so I ended up writing something which ended up getting printed, which I think Chris ended up reading, which made him text me one day and say, hey, do you want to do something at the Terrace talks on the Megachurch? And I said, oh, you've baited the hook really well. That kind of sounds really interesting and something that I would like to do. And then the more I've got into it, the more I've realised there's just so much out there. There are so many books and podcasts and articles and opinions and viewpoints and stories that this got more complex rather than less complex. So I kind of feel like this talk's kind of like half prepared, half baked, because it's just, I got overwhelmed with the sheer amount of stuff that's there. But it does buy into an area of interest for me, because way back in a previous life, did some sociology on why people leave Christian churches and what happens to their faith, and this kind of has some resonating pieces to that story. So let's get underway. On Sunday the 24th of July, Nicky Gumbel gave his last message as the vicar of Holy Trinity Brompton. He had been part of that church for 46 years, and for 17 years he was the vicar in charge of the church at Holy Trinity. Probably one church that you have, definitely many of you will know. It's a church which definitely fits the category of being a megachurch. About 4,500 people in the London mix of churches that they've got, 10 services on a Sunday, hundreds of people coming through the doors during the week for the Alpha services, and there's not a hint of controversy, of lack of reputation, of misuse of power, of any allegations. He retired after that period of time, having made a significant influence to his local church. 74 churches around Great Britain, which are part of the HTB network, which are mostly revitalising churches that have been produced to very, very small numbers. And then obviously with the Alpha course, influencing millions across the world. In his message that day, which he called "The Best Is Yet to Come," he said, I am so proud of our congregation. I absolutely love the people here, and that's the thing I will miss the most. That's the only thing I will grieve leaving here. I just love them so much. They are wonderful, generous, serving, praying, brilliant people, and I will miss them hugely. And I want to suggest to you that is an indication of a different spirit to what you'll meet in some of the other stories that I want to tell a little bit later on. But megachurches are not new. In fact, if you take the day of Pentecost, on the first day of the church, there was a community of 3,000 people that would later grow to 5,000 people. So let's not pretend that big churches or megachurches are anything particularly new in history. They're not. Nor is big bad, and nor is small good. That is far too simple. And when we're looking at the megachurch, I think it's other factors rather than simply size that we need to consider. So let's just look at America for a second. In the 1920s, Chicago Gospel Tabernacle was about 5,000 people. Baptist Temple, Philadelphia, about 3,000 people. St. George Episcopal Church in New York, about 6,000. Riverside Church, New York, about 8,000. There's nothing new about these big churches. In the 18th century, Charles Spurgeon's church was around 6,000 on a Sunday. George Whitefield, about the same size. In the 16th century, the Protestant churches of France had a church with around 10,000 people. But what is different is the modern megachurch phenomena. And whilst at any one time before the 1970s, there might have been a dozen, maybe a dozen and a half large churches, there are now hundreds, if not thousands, of churches that are over the 2,000 mark that would normally consider a church a megachurch. And some of these have become really significant players in the influence of the church around the world. One of the major ones would be Willow Creek, planted by Bill Hybels in 1975, planted with a kind of real focus on seeker-sensitive people, trying to make church a place that was inviting, attractive, and safe and comfortable for middle to upper middle class America. 2018, there are about 25,000 members in 7 satellite churches. And sadly, this is one of the churches which has had a massive demise in recent years. Or Hillsong, Brian Houston in Australia. Or Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill in America. Or, closer to home, what's been the accusations and story coming out around the Arise Church here in New Zealand. So these churches have gone through some really difficult times, and I want to get to that soon. They've also had enormous media interest. In fact, I think there's another talk, and just why are people so fascinated by this topic? You know, if on Easter Sunday there had been the appointment of a new leader of any church in New Zealand, there's no way it would make stuff first article in the news. But there's one under demise, and it does make top of the news cycle. Why this interest? Some of you will have probably listened to the rise and fall of Mars Hill. I started listening to it driving back from Dunedin sometime last year. I think I could have kept on driving probably all the way to Australia and still not got through the whole series. It's massive, and they keep on adding subsequent post-series to it, which goes into a lot of detail. It's the #1 podcast in Christian spirituality religion series around the world at the moment, and it's the most popular podcast that Christianity Today has ever put out. Or the rise of David Farrier. Who had heard of David Farrier more than 3 months ago? A few had, okay, all right. I certainly hadn't, but you can't get away from hearing about him now. And there's been a plethora of books that have come out around this topic as well. Trying to understand what is going on in the megachurch movement. This guy, Chuck DeGroat, in his book, When Narcissism Comes to Church, sadly in recent years we've witnessed too many instances of charismatic Christian leaders gaining a massive following, both within the church and on social media, only to be exposed as manipulative, abusive, and dictatorial. By the way, that's not just a factor of big churches. Small churches can do that just as much. It just doesn't hit the media as well. And there's kind of a conundrum around this, which is summed up in Nancy Beach's comments when she talked about her own situation within Willow Creek. She was a pastor in Willow Creek, and she poses these 2 comments. How could he have done all this good when there were such dark things happening behind the scenes? And a lot of the media and a lot of the writing talks about how can these 2 things coexist together within these churches. They have done enormous amounts of good, and many people's lives have been influenced, positively changed, come to faith, and speak very highly of their experience, and yet there's been so much pain. Nancy Beach again. She was Willow Creek's first female pastor, and she was the one who, one of the ones who came out with her accusations of her own story. She recounted more than one conversation or interaction she felt was inappropriate during moments alone with Hybels over the years that she worked for him. I'm not going to go into detail, but they certainly were. He changed my life. I wouldn't have had the opportunities I've had, she added. I know that I'm very clear on that. I credit him for that, but that there's this other side as well. And so there seems to be this mix of what's going on. One of the articles I found helpful was an article on grunge, which I'm not normally a reader of grunge, but when you start tracking things, you find things. And they put in around 10 key themes that were part of the dark side of the megachurches. And so I'm just going to run through them for a second. And these are the themes that they highlighted. Firstly was a linking to the prosperity gospel, the idea that if you have faith and you please God, then God will reward you materially and financially. And the indications of that reward are the indications of the strength of your faith and your commitment. And then, of course, inversely, poor people or people who are suffering must be something wrong with their faith. It has the double sides to that coin. But it also gives cover to the leaders and the pastors to live luxurious lifestyles, to have wonderful homes or wonderful holidays or cars, because clearly, if they are people of faith and you follow the prosperity gospel, then wouldn't God be rewarding them with material success? And of course they have the nice car, and it's a sign of God's blessing. That's the first thing they saw. The second thing was it's built on and promotes individualism. Or maybe, I should say, Andrew, I'm going to yabber for a while, and then I'm going to open it up for let's talk together, because there's a whole lot more ideas, thoughts, and wisdom in this room than just me. They kind of promote meism. They promote, if you like, a self-centeredness. Everything's turned on to make it comfortable and easy to come to church and to put on programs that I want to go to. But that also feeds a nature that's about me. It's about what I want. If you're running 10 services with 10 different worship styles and I go to the one that I want, it feeds that sense of me getting what I want from church. And a lot of work was done by these mega churches to really hone in sociologically and to understand their clientele or their customer. It looks a bit funny now, but if you go on the net and get Saddleback Sam's image, that Saddleback Church, one of the biggest mega churches, researched the person they expected to come to their church, and they drew a profile of them, kind of where they lived, what they did for a job, how many people in their family, what they enjoyed, what would turn them off church, what they wanted from a church. And they kind of pitched everything to reach these people. But in doing so, it creates a very me-centered kind of culture. Mega churches erode community. There's many ways that they do this, but one of them is very simple. People drive to go to church. And in America, for instance, people could drive past many churches to get to the church of choice. When you're driving, you're less invested in your community. When you get there, the people who choose to come to that church really don't represent the community around, geographical community around the church. They're outsiders who come in for a particular event, turn around and drive away again at the end of it. So they're not really investing in that community either. And because the church offers you everything that you might need in terms of recreation and sports facilities and anything that's going on, and takes a lot of your time, you're not really investing in your local neighbourhood either. So it actually erodes community, but even when you get there, because of the size of the numbers of people that are there, you really know very few. And it's pitched to come and to be entertained or to be educated. So it kind of erodes a community. It turns worship into entertainment. I don't need to tell you this, enormous amounts of production and professionalism that goes into making the megachurch services what they are, but also encourages observation and enjoyment more than participation. A lot of talk in the stuff that I've read about megachurches being run like corporations, and I want to come back to this a little bit more later on, but also the profile of the pastor as the CEO, and particularly following on from Bill Hybels, who was very much a business person and focused on business and focused on the church being like a business. That kind of grew in the megachurch movement. Megachurches, though, have got two great differences over any other company. One, they have many hours of voluntary labour for free. Most businesses would love to have that. And even more so, they are tax exempt. So whilst you might use some of the business practices, there's some real advantages that churches have there. They turn pastors into celebrities. The key difference probably between the local church and the mega church is the celebrity status and adulation given to the pastors. They're increasingly political. Several banded together to help elect and then re-elect Donald Trump. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And they can lean towards conservative and racist views. One of the studies I read talked about, according to the Baptist News Global, 27% of black practicing Christians felt pressure to give up their racial identity in order to belong to their megachurch. They talked about code switching, the expectation that I would dress differently, speak differently, and behave differently than my community, my own national community would behave. To be part of this group, I have to turn up differently. And those who were African American, 28%, found it difficult to build relationships and to fit in even though they tried. It tends to lean towards complementarist views of male and female. So male and female are made differently, we get that, and have different roles. And men's roles are around leadership, power, decision-making, control in the home and in the church. Wives are expected to submit. I've been working on that for the last 38 years of my marriage. And my wife's here, and it's failed. But not in these churches, anyway. And tend to be anti-LGBTI communities. 0% of the mega churches in the United States of America affirm LGBTQI community. 0. So there's some trends. I thought we might look at 3 stories and try and look as these 3 large mega churches have been crumbling because of some crazy behaviour. Is there some common themes? So the 3 here are Mark Driscoll from Mars Hill, Bill Hybels from Willow Creek, and James Mcdonald from Harvest Church. As it says, they were celebrities in the evangelical Protestant community. They're respected authors, inspiring leaders, and faithful preachers. And all 3 of these pastors failed significantly in unique ways. I'll get to that soon. Despite the unique circumstances surrounding each pastor's departure, their situations also share striking similarities. In the blue there is a master's thesis that I found really, really helpful. So it's called Mega Churches Can Have Mega Problems. And if you want to go looking for something that's worth reading, this certainly has a good summary of the data. Christians as well as non-Christians have been shocked by the number of megachurch pastors who have been revealed as bullies, as narcissists, and as sexual assailants. Although incidents often impact a single church, the reasons and the impact spread far wider. Going first to Mark Driscoll. So if you've listened to the Mars Hill stories, you know this inside out. He was known as being a bold and unapologetic leader who focused on Gen X or millennials and pitched them in the inner city, particularly of Seattle, where he himself was living and started the church, and then pitched specifically at men and called men to man up, to take responsibility, to organise their lives, to get a job, to look after their families, and to take responsibility and leadership in their homes. He was known as being bullying and pushy, and staff talked about a culture of fear. If you've listened to the podcast, this quote goes on much longer and with more detail than I've put here. But he says there's a pile of dead bodies behind the Mars Hill bus when he's described how Mars Hill grew. And by God's grace, it'll be a mountain by the time we're done. Something different there between Nicky Gumbel's approach to his people and this approach to people. You either get on the bus or you get run over by the bus. So he was asked to leave, I'll go into detail soon, because of a bullying, domineering, and overly powerful culture. The theology of Mars Hill was distinct. It's a Calvinist church, was a radical Calvinist church, so that they believe that only those who are chosen by God for eternity will be saved. In fact, he called the rest of us matchsticks in his sermons. We're just being made to burn like a matchsticks, and was strongly complementarian, strongly that women have their place. There's no woman pastors in the church. Women had their place in the home, in the workplace, and in the church, and it was very clear. The church structure was one of complete independence. It wasn't part of a denomination, but it was part of the Acts 29 network, which he also began. But it was just a network of churches that did their own thing, and there was no sort of controls or balances. And the response to the allegations when they came out from Driscoll was, "It's lies, it didn't happen, it's not my fault." He was accused of bullying, threatening and lying, and misusing church funds. He was accused of using $200,000 of church money to buy copies of his own book to make sure that it went to the top of the sales list. It's legit, eh? In August 2014, Driscoll was removed from leadership in the church and from Acts 29 church movement, and only 2 months later, Mars Hill Church announced that it would dissolve, and all the Mars Hill churches ended. What was interesting was, though, that Driscoll went on to plant another church and remained 2 years later unrepentant and not acknowledging what happened. Someone else in the church, a guy Darren Patrick, who was pastor of Journey Church St. Louis and former vice president of the Acts 29 network, was removed from leadership 2 years later for being manipulative, domineering, lacking a biblical community, and a history of building his identity through the ministry and media platforms. When the guy de Groot talked with a young pastor from the Acts 29 movement about his hopes and dreams, this is the guy who wrote about the narcissism of the church, 4 years after Driscoll was forced to stand down, this guy who he called Zach, he said had tendencies towards narcissism. And Zach fought back when he pointed that out to him, blaming those tendencies on his wife. Zach told de Groot, "She's lazy. She needs to understand how vital our work is for the kingdom. She needs to be mission-focused. Eye on the ball. My anger is for her edification." What I'm saying there is, whatever Driscoll did and was forced to stand down and caused the demise of his church completely, nothing changed in the subsequent 6 years within that church network. Bill Hybels, well known, planted the Willow Creek Community Church in 1975, started with following on from Dr. Schuler's kind of approach. So Schuler started the Crystal Cathedral, and Schuler made a great place to be in church. He also had the first drive-in church, so you could drive in and just plug in your message into your car, make it as comfortable as possible. Schuler had a very liberal theology, everyone goes to heaven, very inclusive, very positive psychology, everyone welcome. And Hybels came along and picked up the same model, but for a different generation. He was focused on the boomers, not the generation that Schuler was focused on. And when Hybels and Saddleback were starting, the suburbs were the great place to live in America. And so the boomers were moving into the suburbs. And so what these guys did was they worked out the suburbs that were growing the fastest, and they planted their churches there. Bill Hybels planted the church in a picture theatre and invited people to come to church as if it was a picture theatre, and that was the modus operandi of Willow Creek throughout the rest of the time. Suburbs built malls, and affluent America liked shopping malls, and as the shopping malls got bigger, the megachurch learnt from the shopping malls, and they got bigger as well. The comfort, the layout, the style, the look, the feel of the megachurch, of the Hybels style, seeker-sensitive churches, was very much in line with the modern shopping mall. Right, moving on. In 2014, Hybels was accused of being engaged in inappropriate behaviour, including suggestive comments, extended hugs, unwanted kisses, and invitations to his hotel room. He, when interviewed, completely denied the accusations. He said this was either a media beat-up or the act of Satan. Then in August 2018, the New York Times broke a story titled, "He's a superstar pastor. She worked with him and says he groped her repeatedly." A woman who was his secretary accused Bill Hybels of coercing her into over 2 years of sexual favours. She was now the 7th woman who had come forward to accuse Hybels of the same thing of using his power to intimidate and to coerce women into spending time with him alone and then moving on. And then on from there in a sexual way. In 2019, the Willow Creek Church appointed an independent advisory group to go and investigate the accusations that were brought against Bill Hybels. When they came back and presented their report, they observed that Hybels instilled a strict and authoritative corporate culture to feed his hunger for power. The independent group concluded that allegations of sexual assault, intimidation, and inappropriate language were credible and would have been punishable if Hybels had continued as a pastor, but he had already stepped down. After the independent inquiry group report came out, the new lead pastor and all of the elders of the church resigned. Hybels had preyed on women in the church that trusted him, had used his power and prestige to abuse them, and continued to exercise power in order to silence the women that he had harmed. And the board took responsibility for the culture that they had overseen during that period that allowed for that happening. Now, theologically, this is a completely different church to the one at Mars Hill. It's a conservative evangelical church. It's a typical evangelical community. One of the shocking things is that people said, well, a lot of these churches don't have great leadership structures. But Willow Creek had gone to a lot of work to create a very structured and well laid out leadership organisation. Willow Creek's structure was based on a plurality of elders. The church website said, and they acted on, by relying on consensual agreement of godly elders selected from the congregation, the church creates a healthy checks and balances of leadership, direction, financial accountability, spiritual guidance, and ministry implementation. They prided themselves on the strength of the governance of the church, and yet this happened. Last example, James Mcdonald and the Harvest Bible Church. Again, the church was founded by Mcdonald. By 2020, there are over 12,000 weekly attenders and 100 churches that associated themselves as being part of a network of the Harvest Bible Church. This is different in that it wasn't about being domineering, bullying, and overly powerful. This was about, or sex, this was about money. And this guy put his hand in the pocket of the church. In 2013, a group of current church elders accused Mcdonald of repeated patterns of pride, domineering, and mishandling money. Within 24 hours, the church ran a video at the next service where 3 of those elders who had signed the letter were told to stand down. They had been unanimously rejected for the great sin of being divisive. And were told if they had a fraction of the constant and ongoing grace and humility that we see in their pastor, they would learn a lot. A year after that, there was more financial accusations brought about a lavish lifestyle, about the pastor violently defacing the photos of people in his eldership who disagreed with him. I found that was really a helpful move myself, actually, but with a butter knife and a pellet gun. In February 2019, he was removed from his position as senior pastor. The church stated that he was engaging in conduct contrary and harmful to the best interests of the church, including vacations, including going hunting in Africa for exotic game at the expense of the church. They never offered me that when I was a pastor. After a few months, he had started his own radio program after being asked to step down, James Mcdonald Ministries, and carried on. This church is theologically almost fundamentalist, very literal reading and understanding of the Bible, and they were part of one of the biggest denomination in America, the Southern Baptist denomination. So why do these churches implode? Well, all 3 of these stories are different. One's about power, one's about sex, one's about money. One's a completely independent church, one's part of a network, one's part of a denomination. Some have got internal structures for leadership, and some have got really strong structures for leadership, and yet it all fell down. And the responses, the only thing that's probably the same as the responses of all 3 senior pastors who continued to deny and put the blame elsewhere for the accusations. I'll just read you a bylaw of the church James Mcdonald started in their church. A senior pastor can only be removed by a unanimous vote of the entire elder board as well as the executive committee, a committee that Mcdonald himself sat on as lead pastor. The bylaw continued in Mcdonald's favour by authorising the senior pastor to act in an emergency to suspend any elder board member, subject to the earliest possible ratification by the rest of the committee. It was stacked in his favour. Mcdonald on Facebook continues to claim nothing. So what do we do with these? Driscoll, Hybels, Mcdonald were often feared by those within their church. They played on the emotions of parishioners, and all three created a culture of fear. Pastors and board members in all three churches flat out denied the accusations as toxic and abusive and damaging to the church. In fact, that was one of the things that stood out the most to me, is the impression management that church leaderships go into to protect the position of their pastor and even more so the ongoing ministry of the church, which I found fascinating, because if you read scripture, God seems to pull the plug on people quite regularly and expose them for what's going on, and God doesn't need to be protected by impression management. God doesn't need any church, but they kind of build a culture where God needs this particular person and God needs this church. All right. Shall I stop for a second? Is there anything you want to say, ask, or I'm coming towards the close, but just on those bits. Keep it coming. Okay. Some things that stood out. The consumer mentality in the church. There's a wonderful incident in the Gospels where James and John's mum comes to Jesus and says, can one sit on the left, one sit on your right? And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And it seems that heartbeat becomes something of the heartbeat of the culture of these churches. That the church is there for me and what I want, and God is there for me and what I want. It seems that there's a stark difference to this final message of Nicky Gumbel in his church. What do you notice? It might be a big church, but it doesn't look like a mega church. It's an old Anglican church, renovated. It's different. It's not about so much about him or the people who come. The corporatization of the church. I, years ago, being a good sociologist, read these books on the Mcdonaldization of society. These are 25 years old, and the Mcdonaldization of the church. And the argument of these books is really simple, is McDonald's works. And McDonald's works because of four things. It is efficient. It is calculable. Every time you go into McDonald's, anywhere in the world, you're going to get the same thing. You know what you're going to get. You know what it's going to taste like. You know what's in it. You know the flavors, everything. It's predictable. It's laid out the same. It looks the same. It feels the same. It tastes the same. And finally, it's got control built into its systems. And those four things became the pedestals of modern companies like McDonald's. It was also the pedestal of how Hitler got rid of the Jews, but that's another story. And these megachurches just use those principles strongly and built on them a strong corporate kind of approach. But the Gospels are a little bit different. So I told you about those two big churches, but the apostles were arrested and imprisoned. Doesn't seem to be the countercultural move that we find in these communities. And the church in Jerusalem provides for the needy members around the world. I found this and I quite liked it. Faith in Jesus gets mixed up with nationalism. In Acts chapter 1 and verse 6, They gathered around Jesus, the risen Jesus, and they said, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom of Israel? In other words, risen Lord Jesus, are you going to make the world good for us? And for people like us. Make the world Israel's kingdom. And there is no doubt that megachurches have been significant voices in the United States of America behind evangelicalism, which was hugely prominent in electing and re-electing Donald Trump. 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in 2016, and 76% in 2020. I just had to tell you this next quote. It's completely and utterly irrelevant, but I just can't help myself. In 2016, Mr. Trump told a crowd in Nevada, "Nobody reads the Bible more than me." I just had to tell you that because I found it and thought it was such a gem. But anyway, when he was asked, "Is that your Bible?" and he's standing outside that church opposite the White House, he said, "It's a Bible." So white evangelicals in America, have a listen. More than any other religious demographic in America, sorry, this comes from Jesus and John Wayne. It's a fascinating story about the politics behind the megachurches and evangelicalism in America. So more than any other religious demographic in America, white evangelical Protestants support preemptive war, condone the use of torture, and favour the death penalty. They are more likely than members of other faith groups to own a gun, to believe citizens should be allowed to carry guns in most places, and to feel safer with firearms around. White evangelicals are more opposed to immigration reform and more negative views of immigrants than any other religious demographic. 2/3 support Trump's border wall. 68% of white evangelical Protestants, more than any other demographic, do not think the United States has a responsibility to accept refugees. White evangelicals are considerably more likely than others to believe that Islam encourages violence, to refuse to see Islam as part of a mainstream American society, to believe that Christians in America face more discrimination than Muslims, that white evangelicals are significantly more authoritarian than any other religious groups, and they express confidence in their religious leaders at a much higher rate than do members of any other faith. There's something happening in the society as well as in these churches, which obviously there was a synergy. Being a white evangelical is a powerful predictor of opposition to gay rights, intolerance towards immigrants and racial minorities, pro-gun control, supporting harsher penalties for criminals, and justifying excessive force against black Americans in law enforcement. There's something about that that's also part of the story. Ironically, in Acts, when they came to Jesus and said, "Lord, are you going at this time to restore the kingdom of Israel?" Jesus said to them, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth." It was a totally different agenda to what they were after. Coming towards the end. Henri Nouwen. A long, painful history of the church is the history of people ever and again tempted to choose power over love, control over the cross, and being a leader over being led. We all are human, and we all fail. When I was 14, I went to youth group, invited to go, and the youth group leader was a guy by the name of Graham. He was physically fit, he was an ex-policeman, he was a builder, he was kind of the sort of person that I could look up to. And I did look up to him, and I learned a lot from him. I became a Christian. I was discipled by him. I used to work on his building sites with him. I used to help him with planting in a deer farm, did all sorts of things with him. My first year of university, when I came to Christchurch, I found out that he had left his wife and 3 children to run off with his secretary. And for me, that was a crisis of faith, because I had trusted in him and looked up to him and kind of, what I did as a teenager, kind of wanted to be like him. In fact, he was kind of my model of what faith was. And I had a huge period of time where I was completely despondent and angry and all that sort of stuff. But I walked out of it 2 or 3 years later with a lesson. I need to trust God and love people. And I had trusted him, Graham, and loved God. Nothing wrong with loving God, but the inverse is more healthy. Trust God, love people. And churches will always let us down. Pastors are only people. I know that. We are. But there can be structures that enable us to have more influence and to not address issues in our life. And that, I think, is more of the issue with the megachurch. See, that's Nicky Gumbel. 4,500 people on a Sunday, 17 years as vicar, 46 years as part of the church leadership. He doesn't look like a megachurch pastor. There's some of the churches that they have replanted. The masters that I talked about says, although the incidents of abuse in Mars Hill, Willow Creek and HBC were isolated, they share common contributing factors: a concentration of power in one person, a lack of sufficient accountability, and a lack of willpower within the system to use the accountability that's there. They were the three things that they thought were the most common. We need big churches, but we need healthy big churches. And we need structures and people within those structures that will hold others to accountability. I had a mentor I went to many years ago. He's a Catholic priest, and he was leading a church of over 1,000 people. And the bishop rang him one day and said, I want to send you out to the back blocks, and you're going to look after a number of small churches where there'll probably be 6 or 7 people at a time. And it was such a come down. And he went and did it, and after 5 years the bishop said, now come back and do this other job. There was something that had to be learnt in the back blocks with churches of 5 and 6 and 7 people that couldn't be learnt in the fast pace and the big of the kind of churches we've been talking about. The places that talk about finding other ways that mitigate talk about the need for preventative structures, churches putting in place policies and preparing for things to go wrong and having preparation for them. Diffusing leadership so it's not all centered in one person and the church isn't all reliant on the gifts of one person. And mitigating, being ready to mitigate. Who else could lead? Who could step in? Who could do this if things change? Right, we'll come to an end. The last thing I was going to say is that for me, there's a difference between evangelism and discipleship, and these churches focused on evangelism. Ironically, Jesus said, go and make disciples. Chris Wright, who's a missiologist, has said the bad result of separating evangelism from discipleship and prioritizing the first is shallowness, immaturity, and vulnerability to false teaching, church growth without depth, and rapid withering away. A focus on charisma and competence rather than character, and a focus on power and control rather than servant leadership. Last passage of Scripture. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven, a time to tear down and a time to heal. It is appropriate that the media have been the prophetic voice and have pointed out and named inappropriate behaviour and structures. But it's also time to heal, to offer forgiveness, to look for improving structures and improving accountability and improving focus so that we can learn from this and go forward. It's not time to diss and walk away, but time to step in and help reform.
We have heard a lot in the news about the Arise in Wellington. Is there any commentary that the other Arise churches are very similar or any difference in them?
So I deliberately didn't go there except for naming it because there's investigations happening and we don't know what they're going to say. But I am sure that there is some truth to the allegations. No, I'm not going to go there, but at least there's some of the people who have come forward absolutely telling the truth. And they, as victims, need to be heard and given space and cared for. And that should be the church's first priority. And then secondly, to put in place the reforms that are needed. But that information hasn't come out. It's really topical. And so I decided to stay away and to stay on stuff that's a little bit more complete in its story.
How does the church avoid outsourcing being a prophetic voice to the media, assuming that we should, as a people of God, be prophetic, and do it in a way that's not just attacking? Like, where's the balance in it, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really fair comment. Some of these churches, the three that I talked about, kind of had systems that silenced people. And that one with Mcdonald, explicitly silencing the elders. So one is to change the system so that voices can be heard, and two is if someone comes with an accusation, taking it at face value, trusting them, caring for them, and making sure that accusation is followed through on appropriately. One of the other things they talked about is making sure churches have external voices and perspectives regularly and are audited for their leadership, their theology, and their financial accountability. But yeah, getting those external voices. I was just being tenacious, I think. We're not going to let go this complaint, this concern, this accusation. We're going to keep on putting it in front of the leaders until the leaders listen. Yeah. But the cards were stacked against the people who raised concerns. Yeah, so these churches have been enabled to grow very, very quickly because they haven't had denominational structures and other things kind of interfering with their pace of growth and the way they want to set themselves up. So that's been a real advantage. But in these situations, they're isolated and alone, and they haven't got people necessarily to come in and offer the advice and the input and the strength that they need. So yeah, I would agree with you. I think just being on your own, it's not particularly Christian in terms of the community of the body of Christ that Paul talked about in Romans, but it also leaves you open to these kind of problems.
Kia ora, Alan.
Kia ora.
Thank you so much for being prepared to address some of this. Appreciate the night so far. My question is, I guess hearing what you're talking about, and I think what strikes me is the power that some of these churches and leaders are holding. And I think, how do we implement, or how are some of these things implemented? Kind of jumping off what was spoken about just then. Some of these churches that are isolated, that don't have great structures in place for accountability, etc. We've already heard of 3 leaders who are unwilling years later to put their hands up. I fear these churches aren't going to move and can't be moved. So what will happen? How do we get these churches to become better structured churches with that kind of power holding, where there's a lack of willingness to repent?
Thanks for an easy one. So one of the things that seemed obvious is that these things didn't happen overnight. There was an evolving of behaviour and culture over many years. And of course, as the longer that went on, the longer the individual's sense of entitlement to behave in inappropriate ways was built, and the quieter the leadership structure became to stop that. So I guess I want to go, first of all, and say, deal with the small things early on and deal with them well. That seems to me to be very, very important. You know, making sure people in leadership in all organisations, including churches, have got good mentoring and good support and are pulled up on the first hints of behaviour that is inappropriate in whatever field, and kind of encouraged or forced to face into that weakness in their own life and deal with it early on. Secondly, I'd want to say churches that are listening now put in place structures that will help prevent that happening in the future. So now's the time to think about what what authorities we're going to put around in an individual leader, whoever that might be, senior pastor obviously, and what policies we're going to put in place if an accusation is brought. How will we handle it? And how will we make sure we're protecting and caring for the person who's bringing the complaint or concern? And then thirdly, when it is ensconced in a particular individual and it is ensconced in the structure of the church, then don't be surprised if there is a downfall later. You know? But these two things I think we can do. So when we're starting out in small, or someone's new in the game of leadership, set in place good procedures right from the start. And churches that are willing to listen, have a look at what your structures are. Who is keeping this person accountable? Who's really talking to them about the honest stuff? What isn't good in their life or the way that they operate that needs to be addressed and talked about? And what policies and procedures have we got ready for when things go bad? And particularly, how will we care for those who make the accusation or make the concern? Because they are the victim and they need to be the priority of the church. The third one is it's ensconced, it's happening. Someone needs to pull the rug, and there's probably no other way it's going to happen but the rug being pulled.
Thinking about those three examples, and I guess the Australian example and the New Zealand ones as well, one thing that occurs to me, and I'd be interested if this has come up in the research, that I think all of those men were founders.
Yes, correct.
Is there anything to comment on that?
Yeah, I really listened to the Mars Hill thing, and they made some interesting comments. One is, it's an audacious person who goes out and says, I'm going to plant a church. And while I think it was 68% of church plants are still running 2 years later, there's still a big fallout. But then to take that from a church plant to something with 5, 10, 6, 8, whatever thousand people, that's a tremendously gifted and talented person. So, but with that comes that thing about, is it about talent and competence, or is it about character? How much attention is on the talent and the competence? Like apparently Driscoll's got a photographic memory. He's incredibly articulate. He's a smart man. And all of that was on show on the stage. Very clever. But what about the character development? So these people start it, and they set in place the structures, and they run it, and it grows, and they get behind it, and it becomes they are the person who's bringing all this good stuff. When Driscoll was accused of things, he used to say, look, 500 baptisms last year. 20 people were baptized last week. God's at work. How dare you accuse me? But the accusation and the truth of the baptisms are both true. It's not this proves that this is wrong. They're both true. But you're right. I mean, all of these churches that I've shown examples are founder churches. In New Zealand and Australia, this is different research. There aren't great examples of founder independent churches lasting into the second generation. They last, but they dwindle. Without a denominational structure or some other body to hold them, they struggle past that founder starter. And there's examples here in Christchurch that tell that.
Kia ora, just Tiaki here. I mean, it's kind of coming on TV3 there, a website article from Celebration Centre, not picking on any church, out in the public domain. Kind of patterns of behaviour over a long period of time which have come to light, and it really appears as though the media has been the only place really where victims have had the opportunity to have a say. I guess coming from a Māori viewpoint, that for me it concerns me that there's a high percentage of Māori that do attend the church there. I used to go there. And so I'm just kind of thinking, there's not really a question, I guess, it's just really an observation that some of the characteristics or concerns you've raised tonight are really quite valid now, and there seems to be a lot more coming into the light. So, I guess it's just a concern from a Māori viewpoint. There appears to be a gravitation to quite sort of charismatic, powerful leaders. And I got a bit of a hunch, and I'm not quite sure what the answer is for that. But yeah, thank you for what you shared tonight. Thank
you. A friend who's Māori says that Māori, he's Māori, so he said this to me, that Māori often like authoritarian structures, and they know where you kind of fit, and I wonder if that's a factor.
One of the things that seems to happen when these sort of stories break is they send a bit of a shockwave around the world, not just in the Christian community, but also, I think, in the secular community. And sort of a two-part question is, do you think that actually does a lot of damage to the Christian church and the Christian faith outside of just that community? And also, do you think it actually may provide us with some form of an opportunity to step into that place as you see the conversation hit the mainstream media?
Yeah. Well, I think it's discouraging for everyone. You know, whether we like the church or not, we kind of hope it's going to be a place that's doing good. And secondly, I think our reaction is quite powerful. And there's two extreme reactions. One is to deny the accusations, to deny that it's happening, or to try and, bolster as if it's not a true concern that's being raised. And the other one is just to join the cynical side and say, well, it's all like that, and it's all bad, and it's all, give up, and there's nothing here to work with. I think both of those extremes are unhelpful. One's a denial, and one's kind of like, oh, just ditch it. Which is why I put up that thing about there's a time to tear down and a time to heal. So to be agents of naming the truth, standing with the truth, but also working for healing. Whatever that means.
Alan, thanks for all you've shared tonight. I guess, would you say, looking at the three examples you've given tonight, and then thinking about governance and structure, there would almost tend to see an era, like there's an era, an age bracket of leadership or a style of leadership that might have been marked by an era, and I think the media in New Zealand may well just be picking up on a new era that's emerging. There's been an undertone for a while, even within churches, of higher accountability, leadership structure and transparency. And perhaps we're seeing a shift and less tolerance to what maybe a previous era weren't questioned the same way.
Yep. So you're saying even before these allegations that came out, churches were moving to more accountability?
I think if you think about the millennial voice,
Yep.
Things that are going on, I think there's been an undercurrent for a while of higher transparency, greater accountability.
Yes.
But different eras of leadership find that easier or harder.
Totally.
And same with governance.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I agree. Good point.
Looking at the other way, so was it Nancy Beach or Nancy Altman all fall out at Willow Creek, and James Mcdonald was weaponising the word divisive. So leadership can use these sort of words and weaponising it. How do we go about having the pastoral side of allowing people to come forward? How do we have discernment between grumbling and raising genuine concerns? So, would you like to comment?
It's a tough question, isn't it? All concerns need to be taken at face value and listened to by a person who can act. How's that for a start? But not all accusations are true or completely true. And so there needs to be obviously careful discernment of that. But I don't think a concern or allegation can be dismissed until it's been heard by an appropriate person who has the ability to investigate further or to enable an investigation. I just think we live in a society now where, for the sake of the church and how it's perceived in its life, this is not okay to dismiss the investigation, to dismiss the concern before it's been heard fully and there is the opportunity to investigate it further. Yeah, and that's where I think, if you've got an eldership or a group or a person, more than one person, who can weigh that, then that has to be done. And of course they won't get it perfectly right, and they are human too, but hopefully they are, one, distant from the accusation itself, the centre of that accusation. It's not the person who's being accused who's weighing the concern, so that's number one. And two, that they are one or two people who have got the ability to weigh that carefully, prayerfully, honestly, and look into it. And they obviously have the voice of the leadership structures to push that further if they feel it's needed. Yeah. But yeah, some things are grumbles, you know, and some things are genuine, and sometimes it's really hard to tell the difference. So that's why I guess I'm leaning more to listening and being open, anticipating that this is true until I know it's not true.
I don't know whether I can, or I've completely formulated this question, but I guess what I'm wrestling with and pointing fingers at myself is, where is the Christian prophets? Like, you know, I tend to think that the media, in this case, David Farrier, has done a brilliant job.
I agree, totally agree.
I also acknowledge your comment before that it's very hard to move from inside these establishments, and probably even harder from outside. But where was my voice, and you know, what would be the appropriate response when it's not your church, but you know, we're part of that body or something like that.
Yeah, when it's not your church, yeah, that's
Yeah.
hard. Because
But
that's the sort of
it's
situation
our
that you're
church,
raising. Yeah. Yes, but you're carrying a concern for a church that you're not presently part of and the people here. And there isn't a denominational body where you can go and say, hey, I'm concerned about this. Can you guys, you people, step in and investigate? Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Just on the back of that, I know you mentioned on Easter, the Stuff article was, like, it was huge clickbait for that day.
Totally.
I have a lot of friends outside of the church, and I've actually asked them, like, do you see these articles that are going on? Many of them are like oblivious to it. They don't actually know.
Yeah.
Generally, in my circle of friends, I have a lot of people who are quite disillusioned by the church and have had experiences in megachurch structures. How do you handle that? As somebody who absolutely passionate about church, I really struggle with being able to have the conversation with those people who have just been so hurt by the whole system of church. Do you have any tips for...
Can you ask him to answer my question first?
And the second question on that is the whole toxic positivity.
Yeah.
I know Francis Ritchie wrote quite a lengthy article
Yes.
about toxic positivity. So, a bit like the gentleman over here that was saying, if you bring something that's even slightly controversial, negative, seen as criticism, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, Phil, to go back to your question, I don't know if a church is an independent church and you're not inside there as a person who's attending or a member or got the voice of the leadership, what can you do? How do you get a voice in there? I mean, the only thing you can do is to build a relationship with someone who is inside and who does have some clout, some voice in the organisation, because you know, the one you're talking about today, that's in the Radio New Zealand article, they're not listening to outside voices. And unless you've got some relational currency, it's unlikely that they will listen. So, yeah, sorry, I didn't answer it directly, but I kind of jumped here and, yeah. But the gentleman who raised the question about, so anecdotally, around 30 to 40% of New Zealanders have left church as adults and left with some degree of disillusionment, hurt, pain, or change to their faith and beliefs. So there's a large catchment out there who will be reading this and who will have had experiences in churches that they're comparing that article to. And this will, I assume, strengthen their concerns. Yeah. So that's fair. That's fair. I've always said, because this is my area in a previous life, was kind of people who leave church. Don't focus on the church, focus on God. Don't talk about, you know, what's right or wrong with the church. Just talk about your faith with Christ. You know, talk about this is what it means to me. This is what I'm doing. This is where I'm at. And they may well have a faith too. There are many de-churched people who continue in a faith. But if you start the conversation with the church, it nearly always goes downhill. If you start the conversation with my experience and my experience of God, it's a far more plausible place to begin and to find resonance in someone else's story and life, which might lead to conversations about the church, but it's not the first place. Yeah. And I think we have to lament and fully feel the pain of people. And it's uncomfortable when they say, your God sucks and worse, or your God doesn't exist and worse. And it kind of hurts something deep within us. But I think we need to sit with that. Because lament is part of prayer.
I just was, you commented about toxic positivity.
Oh, yes.
And I wanted to comment that there's a writer, Kate Bowler, who's a Duke Divinity School historian, and and her main area of research is American megachurches. And she was writing this book about the history of the American megachurch and Pentecostal churches called Blessed, and in the time she was diagnosed with stage 4 bowel cancer. She was 35 and just a new baby and things like that. And she writes between those two worlds, and she's a fantastic writer, and
Absolutely.
I commend her work to anyone.
Yeah, totally agree. She's great.
No, we're good. Alan, thank you so much. And I wonder if we could give Alan a round of applause just for...